Hey guys, time to give you another books to documentary review, this time on one book, and boy what a doozy of a book it is. It is Sebag Montifiore's Romanovs, the Romanovs I should say, 1613 to 1918. This gigantic book is an attempt to look at the entire Romanov dynasty as a whole. A lot of people know the name Romanov because of Anastasia Romanov. That's a very famous story tale. There was a cartoon movie made, which is amazing, and they just made a Broadway play about it, and it's fantastic, except that it has like no root in any real history ever. When I found out the real story of Anastasia when I was younger, I was really upset. So yeah, don't believe that fairy tale. But anyways, the Romanovs are actually like the most impressive dynasty of Russian history. They ruled Russia from 1613 to 1918. That's like 300 years worth of one family, and they had some of the biggest names in Russian history. Peter the Great was a Romanov, Catherine the Great was a Romanov by marriage, but still, they are just this crazy story, and it's one of these things that you wouldn't believe it if it was fiction. You just say, nah, this is too much. This is not real. So I had read, of course, you potentially saw my review of Catherine the Great, her biography, and I'd been interested in the culture, but I hadn't been able to find a book that gave equal amounts of time to all of the rulers, because while there is 300 years of history, people tend to focus on Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and like Nicholas and Anastasia and that whole thing. So three very specific points in history that we're focused on. So when I saw this book on our new and paperback table, I went, oh my god, this is perfect. This is like a grand overview on a scale that, you know, links the politics together, links the cultural together, shows you a progression in time for Russia, the Russian people, the Russian culture, Russian politics, and just, you know, puts it all together in a way that individual biographies of individual people never could. I also liked from the beginning that the book made a specific effort to give equal time to each monarch. So instead of, you know, shortening the time spent on monarchs that didn't really do that much and elongating like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, which is usually what happens, this, you know, did give more time to people with, you know, longer reigns and stuff like that, but made an effort to talk about the politics and the culture and the personality of every Romanov monarch instead of, you know, really narrowing it down to the few big names. I think, though, that the only nice thing that I have to say about this book is that it did provide that kind of overview. It had a couple of really weird things to it, and the first and foremost is the focus on the sexual and like the deviant and all these really crazy things, because there are some crazy, you know, sexual story escapades, deviant behavior. It can get pretty weird with almost every monarch, and just the focus on these facts and these factors, which might not have even have been facts. Like, it was just weird. It was like looking through almost every single monarch in terms of his sexual proclivities or, you know, sexual escapades, and that was super weird. I was like, I'm not really here for this until, like, I was gonna say until the part on Nicholas and like the Russian Revolution, but that's not even true, because they focus on how like Nicholas and Alex were like always sending these letters about, and how they named, you know, like their different body parts and gave them code names so they could talk about them in letters. It was weird, and it was like kind of uncomfortable. And I mean, I guess, you know, like the letters, for instance, those are facts, but it's not why I'm here. And for it to be so present in every single story, it's just like, okay, like, come on. They weren't just their sexual proclivities or whatever. They were like czars, and they were ruling a country. And can we get back to that? And that was like, that was really aggressive feeling. So that I did not like so much. Yeah. There are also a lot of footnotes in this, which didn't even seem connected to what you'd be reading about. And so this book was so big that I listened to it part in audio and part in the text form. And in the audio, you could always tell where the footnotes were, because even though they didn't say, like, this is a footnote, it would just be like this random paragraph of information that kind of, sort of related to the topic at hand. But sometimes I would be reading a footnote and just be like, why is this here? Like, this is not important information. It doesn't illuminate anything for me at all. It doesn't expand on this point at all. It was just like, I also know this, and they shoved it in a footnote. It was really weird, and after a certain point, I just stopped reading footnotes because I knew that there wouldn't be any interesting or, informative information there. I just moved on, kept reading the actual text of the book, which at least progressed in a linear fashion. One of the things about Simon that I knew from the beginning is that Simon is not Russian. Simon is English, and while he is a Russian scholar, that doesn't always mean facts. And so I went and I looked for Russian takes on this book because I wanted to see what the actual country that the book was written about was saying. And apparently there are a lot of non-facts in this book, like tall tales or maybe kind of potentially true tales that are wild enough that Simon kind of writes them off as why not true kinds of things. And while some of them you can't prove or disprove, some of them you definitely can disprove, it worries me that there are these factual inaccuracies. And, Simon's background is in Catherine the Great and is in, Stalin. One of his books is called Young Stalin. So it made sense for why the Russian Revolution part of this book felt really dense and politically, researched, and the rest of it didn't feel as much like that. And it doesn't give me a lot of faith that every single crazy detail in here is real. If there are Russian sources or even just like other Russian scholars being like that's not true. So if you do choose to read this book, take it with a grain of salt. Take it knowing that it's more of a sensationalization of history as well as like an overview of a dynasty. So, again, who's to say how much is real and how much isn't real? I know I don't have the breadth of knowledge of the Romanov dynasty to say yes or no to every single fact, but between the sexual sensationalization and reading those reviews of a couple of places of factual inaccuracy, that's not great. It's not great. I would still say, though, if you are looking for a book to span the entirety of the Romanov dynasty and to learn about some of the rulers that aren't as widely known about, there's nothing wrong with this book. It's raunchy enough to keep you interested, I suppose, and it is filled with things other than sexual sensualization, but again, you have to go into it knowing that that's going to be a really big factor of it, which I didn't, and so I would put down some passages and just be like, also, he likes to give people really weird nicknames, and some of them are real, and some of them are quoted from people who this one time referred to them as blah, but Russian names are not the easiest for me to follow. But he would use someone's name and then use their nickname and then use a different nickname, and at the beginning of every single passage there's a cast of characters basically where he talks about who is going to figure importantly into this passage and who they are. But then you have to also follow 4 nicknames, and it just begins to boggle your brain. It hurts. It really just hurts your head. Okay, that was a side tangent. Anyways, my point is, I recommend the book if you are okay with the caveats that I have mentioned and understand that it may not be entirely factual, although I think you can take a lot of the base facts at face value. But just be sure that if you're reading this, use it as one portion of whatever research or investigation you're doing for yourself. And that brings me to the documentaries that I want to talk about. A documentary has not been made per se on this book, which is, you know, a little bit different. I know this is called books, documentaries, but whatever. While I was, you know, reading this book, I thought, how can there be no one who's also done this? You know, taken a view of the Romanov dynasty. And I found on Netflix Empire of the Tsars by Lucy Worsley, and I have a love-hate relationship with a lot of Lucy's documentaries. Some of them I think are good, and sometimes I think she's just downright silly. And that's definitely my feel of Empire of the Tsars. It's a 3-part series, and while it discusses parts of the Romanov dynasty and parts of the cultural movement and the political movement, it focuses on your heavy hitters, you know, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great. So it didn't really fulfill the whole picture view that I wanted. But if you do want a like short, funny, sort of silly view of the dynasty, you could go there. I really fell in love with a documentary called The Romanovs that I found on YouTube, put out by Star Media. And Star Media, as far as I can tell, this is a Russian-produced Romanov documentary that takes the same idea that Simon had to focus on each of the rulers in the Romanov dynasty and to put each one of them forward and to tell each one's story, even if they ruled for like 2 days or 20 years. They put out their life story, what like their reign was like. Like, not a lot of people know that Peter the Great wasn't ruler originally. Eventually he was like a 3rd or 4th son who his older brother became czar, but he was sickly and then he died, and then there was a civil war and him and his half-brother were both raised as czar. And this documentary takes the time to talk about his older brother who didn't live very long, he didn't rule very long, but talks about what his impact was. And so I think there's like 8 parts to this documentary, and each one takes on, you know, 2 to 3 rulers. And while the narrator that I found is in English, when the animated text that appears on screen is there, it's in Russian. So I don't know if this actually is a Russian documentary or not, but it just is so much less sensationalized, so much more what I was looking for out of the Romanov book in the documentary form. So if you are looking for something like this, but what I've said about this book doesn't, you know, entirely make you happy like it did not me, I recommend that documentary because, again, it's the same idea that I wanted in this, but in a documentary form. Obviously it doesn't get as in-depth as a lot of the chapters in here do, but I mean, if you're just doing it for cursory history purposes, then that's really all you need. So yeah, this is, I feel like, one of the few times where I would ever say watch that documentary over reading this book. I feel usually when I do anything books to movie or books to documentary, whatever, I always feel like, yeah, reading the book was so much more informative, but like by the end this felt like a slog that was focusing on the wrong things. The Lucy Worsley documentary was cute and fun but sort of silly, and then the Star Media documentary was just, it was so good. It was so good, and I've recommended it to like everyone who was interested in Russian history that I know, because it was like, there's the snippet on like every ruler that I wanted to see. Here's that overview that I wanted. So again, Star Media, it's on YouTube, free to watch. Watch that one, and I mean, read this if you feel so inclined. That's it for me today, guys. Bye!